Donnelly, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel, the School of Friendship. It's like the School of Athens, it's just not as many people there. So beginning our discussion will be conflict, fatal fire, or fertilizer for flourishing of friendship. Bill and Peg White from Pensacola, Florida are certified Christian conciliators and certified relational wisdom instructors. I could have used those. Bill is 1963 JD from University of Florida, LLM, Ocean and Coastal Law, University of Miami, Florida. Practiced environmental, criminal, and consumer law before serving as a trial judge for 15 years. He is currently a senior judge. Peg, a retired MSW, Florida State University social worker, created a family shelter, parent-child center, transitional housing program, and jail ministry during 20 years with a Christian soup kitchen. She still teaches at the local jail on a regular basis, and more recently created a ministry of mentorship by older to younger married women called A Wise Woman Builds Her House. Bill and Peg are members of the peacemaking team in their parish, have given several workshops in different Catholic and denominational settings, and are deeply committed to spreading peacemaking, emotional intelligence from a Christian perspective. They have engaged in marriage preparation and support, including worldwide marriage encounter and marriage mediation for over 35 years. They have 5 children and 20 of the top 25 grandchildren in the world.
Good morning. We really appreciate the chance to be here. It seemed really random. We put something in and they chose our paper. So this is going to be really interesting for us. We hope for you. Let's see if I can get this going. There it is. All right. So, our professional lives have been spent dealing with the results of poorly resolved conflict. We've seen devastating effects up close and coming at you. Our culture seems to believe that the way you walk through conflict is by asserting your rights and attacking the other person. If we're civilized, we do it in court. And I assure you that no matter what you think, court is a relational disaster, and even the wrong approach to mediation is just as bad. We've helped people resolve serious conflicts in a number of different contexts, people married for short or long times, families, businesses, schools, and church groups. But how to stay ahead of the fire? You know, every year wildfires devastate thousands of acres of forest and homes. All you need is spark, fuel, add a little wind, and you've got a wildfire. And in relationships, things can get out of hand just as quickly.
Conflict is the fuel of relational fire. Emotions, the oxygen. Sometimes the wind. Personal interactions can provide a spark, a trigger, usually what we say to each other, or how we say it. How often is this scene repeated? The young wife and husband meet at the kitchen at the end of the long day. We call it the killer hour, where they've come home to the baby is now howling, the young children are squabbling, and the pot is boiling over. A slight trigger, and someone is yelling, and soon out of control, and the other one, bewildered, bolts out of the room. Truthfully, the work site, the office, the internet, academia, the public square just reflects what we're doing in the more private spaces, perhaps with a little less light and heat. We had a family that comes to mind that came to us because their 19-year-old daughter was acting out to beat the band, disobeying every rule they had, and they were at wit's end. We're going to toss her out of the house. Can you help us? We don't know, we said. Can we talk to her? And she came and sat like this I thought, oh dear Lord, we need help. And so Bill and I had decided we would say nothing. We would ask her to speak, and if she wasn't going to, we would just let her not speak. But finally, after a while, I felt the urge to say something to her, and I leaned over and I said, sweetheart, could you tell us about your relationship with your father? And she began to bawl. And we knew, bingo, we have touched now on the heart issue. And long story short on that, we were able to help that family come back together without destroying the relationship between them.
So lawyers love definitions. He who makes the definition controls the game. So here's a definition of conflict: difference of opinion or purpose that frustrates someone's goal or desires. But when you think about it, given our different backgrounds, the experiences we've had in life, our perspectives, our values, our training, the traumas we suffered. Some of us suffered trauma in higher education, like myself. Then we're going to have differences of opinion, appearances, goals, and desires. So conflict, it's inevitable. So how do we prevent the negative results that we often have in dealing with the conflict?
Well, we can't simply avoid relationships because life is all about relationships. So we made in the image of our Creator. He is the eternally relational God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, who wants a relationship with us and even calls us friends. If we can't avoid conflict in our relationship, what can we do to prevent relational wildfire? First, we need to reimagine conflict from being a problem to be avoided and to what it truly is, and that is an opportunity to glorify God. As Christians, it's the purpose of our life. Jesus challenges us to live out our love for God and one another in the midst of conflict. In the Gospel of Luke, he says, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. We're called to demonstrate love when we don't feel loved or loving, in the midst of high-stress situations when feelings are strong. But let's talk now about another unavoidable contributor to conflict.
Emotions. They are physiological experiences. They're designed to move us to action, and they impact our thoughts. So science now has been showing us over the last few years that emotions affect us before we fully engage our rational faculties. That's great if you meet a snake walking down a path in the woods. It's a little bit different if it's a relational situation and our emotions are driving us to say or do something before we think through the possible consequences. In high-stress situations, it's a fact that our emotional brain can literally hijack our rational brain and take our whole body with it. If you don't believe this, try writing a talk together for a Notre Dame colloquium. Here's a typical spiral of hijacking, flooding an emotional situation. You have all the setups and there's a trigger. Somebody takes offense, gets defensive, angry, maybe starts feeling a victim, becomes critical of the other person, confused, overwhelmed, hardens themselves, and you got relational failure. That's because as emotions intensify, we have a limited brain capacity and our ability to reason diminishes. The solution: stop the spiral. Anticipate what's coming if you can. Try to prevent it. And if it starts going, try to seize control and reverse the direction. We feel the temperature's going up, most of us. Sometimes we don't. It's on us before we know it. So we also, and that really is developing good relational skills. That's great stuff, and there's been some terrific developments over, the last 30 years in the area of emotional intelligence. Lots of good stuff out there about improving your personal competence, being more self-aware and self-managing, and having good social competence and awareness and relationship management. You know, there's some superb insights you can get from things like Dan Goleman's book on emotional intelligence. But there's something missing. God is the key relational mover, and our secular stuff out there ignores him. What we want to suggest to you is that all relationships with others are three-dimensional, and God is in those relationships with us and others. Here's a sort of a paradigm, a way to look at it. You can see the colors, the self and others, and is like emotional intelligence. That's pretty similar. But God, that aspect is different and certainly a huge addition. Well, in every one of these types of relationships, we need to have two components. We need to be aware of what's going on. That's what do I know about this? And we have to be figuring, what will I do about it? Engaging.
So there are 6 ranges of proficiency. When we are God aware, we remember. Important word, remember. We remember God's character, his works, his promises, and we interpret life in that light. We ask ourselves questions like, who is God? What is he like? Where has he blessed me? And look around and constantly see the evidence of God's grace.
I like to say, you walked in here today, and I'm looking out the window. Sunlight, if I remember my grade school stuff, came down from the sun at whatever speed that was, bounced off that building, and it meets me with rods and cones and a nerve and a brain that can, and lenses that flip it over. That's God's grace in and of itself. It's flowing on us everywhere we go all day long.
Right. We asked our grandchildren one time if they could give us evidences of God's grace that day, which was in the afternoon at a little camp. And all these little kids ran up and told the older ones what to write on the paper we had there. I was so shocked. There was no problem at all. Little brother helped me. Big sister gave me a sweet. I mean, they understood the evidences of God's grace. So when we are God engaged, see, that's God awareness. Now we're talking about God engaged. When we are God engaged, we faithfully trust him, imitate him, and we obey him. The questions we ask are this: when will I trust him? That's important, when. Why should I obey him at all? And how can I imitate him?
You know, there's a little bit different feel for this approach to the emotional intelligence type of stuff than you see in emotional intelligence. So self-awareness is really being able to accurately discern our own emotions, interests, strengths, and weaknesses. We're truly humble in the sense of the real sense of the word. So when have you heard humble in the workplace is how we ought to be acting? How is that in the public sphere? That word just doesn't come up, it doesn't seem these days. And how often are we really able to master our thoughts, words, and actions so that they please God and advance his purposes? We're disciplined in service of God, not ourselves, because he is our creator. As it says in 2 Corinthians, we try to take every thought and word captive to Christ.
And when we're other aware, we're compassionate. We understand. We empathize with the experiences and the emotions and needs of others. And when we're other engaging, we serve. We serve, work with, and resolve conflict, for example, with others constructively.
But of course, none of us are inside that circle all the time. even the best of us. Think, for example, of David, the man after God's own heart. Went real good for a while, and then he really strayed, didn't he? All of us, even the best, can forget rather than remember who God is. We can become fearful rather than faithful, insensitive rather than compassionate, manipulative instead of serving others. We can lapse into indulgence of ourselves and pride rather than discipline and humility.
We really want to remember, though, that those who are outside of that circle, we as Christians who are inside want to bring them back in. That is the whole goal in the relationship.
So, here's a plan. It's the OMG plan. So we ask ourselves in the middle of something, if you think, oh my OMG, well, that's a good time. Instead of saying this, whatever this is out there, convert it into a prayer and a plan. We ask ourselves, what about me? What am I experiencing? What's going on? We try to identify what is going on with us and where those emotions are coming from. We try to be aware of the other and gain insight into where they're coming from and what we will do if we act in the way we feel like we're going. And then we ask ourselves where God is and whether he will be pleased, and particularly what values we will demonstrate, because those around us, our community, are watching and will be influenced by how we live our faith, for better or worse. By the time we're done with that OMG, we've had a time to little cool down, and even 20 seconds can let the hormone levels in our bloodstream drop down and give us a better shot at getting control.
So what if conflict has already gotten out of hand? What do? Fight it out? Or do you flight? It's fight or flight is usually what's going on. This is where most people go, I'm done, I'm out of here. I forgive you, but I'm never going to speak to you again. Our theme, I call you friends, great. But we also need to remember there's more to that phrase in John 15:15. Jesus added, I call you friends because I have told you everything I heard from the Father. Friends need to stay friends. We seem to think we have a choice in that. But as Christians, do we? We're baptized into God's family. That's immutable. But because he calls us friends, hasn't he elevated us to a new status? Reconciliation, forgiveness are essential to him, as he shows us in his words. Friends who stay friends please the Lord and glorify his name simply by struggling through and overcoming their conflict.
So if it's gotten a little further, you couldn't get control over the front end, then what do you need to do? Well, go and be reconciled. Matthew 18:15, Jesus tells us if our brother sins against us, the first thing we should do is go, the two of us, one-on-one, and try to win our brother over quietly. If that doesn't work, go back with one or two others. And in Matthew 5:23, he says if we go to the altar to worship and recall our brother has something against us, then we need to leave the altar and our gift there and go and be reconciled first and then come to worship. So either way, he sins against us, we sin against him. The verb is go, and it's on us as Christians to take that initial step.
To the end. If you're not in the middle of a relational fire now or near one, we can assure you, you will be, no doubt. Just look at the divorce rate, the problems people experience at home, work, and school, and unfortunately, church communities and mission fields are way up there at the top.
We like to say in this group, wherever two or more are gathered in his name, there will be conflict.
So we encourage you to get more knowledge about how to prevent conflict and to get training if you can, because you are very much needed.
Now,
we've enjoyed giving you a brief taste of the concepts from Discovering Relational Wisdom. Thank you for having us. We pray the Lord's peace on you and yours.
Our next presentation will be Wounds in Our Friendship with God, a Psychological Perspective. And our presenter is Jennifer Muñoz. Jennifer earned her Doctor of Psychology in Clinical Psychology from the Institute for the Psychological Sciences, a program that aims to integrate the science of psychology with the Catholic Church's vision of the human person. Her doctoral dissertation considered psychological factors that can affect a woman's experience of a rupture in her relationship with Christ, akin to divorce, after leaving the religious life. She is also a homeschooling mother of 3 in South Bend, Indiana.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start my talk about psychological difficulties in the spiritual life by telling you all a quick story first. My husband and I, as Mr. Donnelly said, we have 3 children. We also had 5 miscarriages. They were all painful, of course. The 4th one was actually a little traumatic for me, and I'll just tell you very quickly what happened. With the first 3 miscarriages, we found out that we'd lost the baby after the fact. But with the 4th one, we went in for the ultrasound. The baby was still alive, so we got to see her alive. But we were told at that point she had a 50-50 chance of survival. So we went home and we kicked into prayer high gear. So we were praying nonstop for the next solid week. But we also asked everybody we knew on both sides of the country and everywhere in between to be praying for us. We had 3 convents, the entire Dominican House of Studies, probably about 500 people praying for this baby. And of course, as you know, she died anyway. So while we were going through this very profound grief, I was also going through very profound anger at God. I felt like I had done everything I needed to do. I was praying for something that was clearly good for the life of my child, and he didn't respond. He ignored me, he abandoned me. And it went on for a couple of years. Now, I tell you this story because I want to kind of situate what I'm going to be talking about. I think we all have stories like this. And to piggyback on what the White said, if you don't, you soon will. Not to be morbid, but this is life, right? There are painful things we all experience. So I'm talking about unanswered prayers for good things, pain and suffering, loss of a loved one, the experience of evil, or as I wrote my dissertation on, people leaving religious life. Often extremely painful. They tried to give God their entire life. It didn't work out for many reasons. The takeaway feeling can be that I was rejected by God. I wasn't good enough. So I refer to all these types of situations as ambiguous situations in our relationship with God, because it raises the question, what is God doing in my life? What is his action in my life right now? It's not clear to me that I'm being loved and heard and supported. So this is the main point I'm going to make in this talk. We all experience these periods of pain and suffering when God's nearness to us and his involvement in our lives is ambiguous. But some people are especially prone to interpret this ambiguity in the spiritual life as indicating some degree of rejection, abandonment, or betrayal by God. And I believe that Bowlby's theory of attachment helps to explain why some people are more quick to interpret it in terms of rejection and why they therefore experience a great deal more suffering than others might. I think it's very ironic, but we can easily fall into the trap of over-spiritualizing our relationship with God. And what do I mean by that? Well, when we experience what feels like abandonment, we assume, well, I just needed to pray more. It's my fault. I don't have enough trust. If I'm experiencing dryness in my spiritual life, I tend to think, well, God is testing me. It's maybe a dark night of the soul or a dark night of the senses. But we forget, I think, we don't have 2 different ways of being in relationship. Regardless of who we are relating to, whether it's a human being or God, we are human. And that means that in some way, every relationship we have, even our relationship with God, is a human relationship. So that means that our relationship with God is prone to the same pitfalls, misunderstandings, and tensions as any other relationship. Now, I only have 18 minutes. I'm going to have to skip over a great deal of research here. I am taking most of this, as I said, from Bowlby's theory of attachment. It was developed in the 1950s, and ever since then has been backed up by a tremendous amount of research. It's a very solid understanding of how we are in relationship. I'm also taking a lot of the research on attachment in our spiritual life from Kirkpatrick and Gronqvist. All right, so very briefly, attachment theory states that everybody develops a set of expectations about their closest, most intimate relationships from their earliest experiences of relationship with their parents. We very quickly come to expect our parents are either going to be nurturing and generally responsive to us in our needs, or cold and rejecting, or some very confusing combination of the two. Some parents will actually sort of oscillate back and forth, which causes deep confusion in the child. What happens is these expectations, as the child gets older, become expanded to include people in general. If I have a close, intimate relationship, maybe with a romantic partner or with God, I will expect that they're going to treat me the same way. Along with those assumptions about other people, we make inferences about ourselves and our own worth. If others are rejecting of me, it's probably because I'm not actually lovable. But if people are accepting and loving of me, then I feel a deeper sense of self-worth. So we now have these two sets of beliefs, beliefs about other people in relationship to us and beliefs about ourselves. And you can put them together to create two intersecting axes, which I'm going to try to pull up for you here. Okay. All right. So what you get when you put these two axes together are 4 quadrants that roughly describe the 4 ways of being in relationship. Now, understand that this is all a continuum. You may be some combination of 2. You could be anywhere along here. You might be here or here or here or closer over there. But just to give a very general description, this is a little bit rough and ready, but 18 minutes. All right. The securely attached individual has a positive view of themselves as lovable and positive expectations from intimacy. So they want intimate relationships and they're not afraid of them. And what that means is when conflict comes up in those relationships, they're typically able to sit with it. They are not hypersensitive to being abandoned, and they can see conflict as an opportunity for growth. Now, I'm going to give you a quick scenario for all 3 of these, to kind of show the differences in these categories. So, an ambiguous situation in a relationship. You get a text message, because I'm assuming everybody here is a millennial. You get a text message from a significant other that says, I'm not sure how I'm feeling about where we're at in our relationship right now. Deeply ambiguous. The securely attached person would respond and say, okay, I'm a little uncomfortable with that, but let's talk. Tell me what's going on. Let's have a conversation about this. They are not, as I said, not overwhelmed by anxiety, and they don't assume that it's automatically going to lead to rejection. They're not assuming that you're going to break up with them. Now, the preoccupied type has a negative view of themselves, which means they expect to be rejected, but a positive view of others. They want intimacy. But they're always afraid of rejection, and so they're hyper alert for signs of it. And they feel that rejection is emotionally devastating. So they get the text. Not sure how we're feeling about our relationship. Within 2 seconds, they respond, what's wrong? What did I do? Are you angry with me? What's going on? 2 seconds later, another text. Why haven't you responded? What's going on? Are you angry? And it will escalate until they get a response back. And by the end, they're sending texts that say, you're cheating on me. I knew it all the time. Just very, very high levels of anger. And again, please remember, I am exaggerating a little bit. I'm trying to give us a quick way of characterizing. And I am definitely not trying to, it's encouraging that you all laugh, but I'm not trying to get people to laugh at this attachment style. All right, now the fearful, they have a negative view of themselves. They expect rejection. They also have a negative view of others. They are afraid of intimacy because they are so afraid of rejection. So the way they deal with that, instead of clinging very tightly to the relationship, they keep everybody at arm's length. And that way, if I'm not that emotionally engaged, I can't be that hurt when the time comes that I am rejected. So they get the text, I'm not sure how I'm feeling about our relationship right now. And they immediately respond, you know what, that's funny, me too. And I actually think we ought to take a break. I'm so confident that you're going to break up with me that I'm going to break up with you first. And that way I can maintain this facade that I'm not really vulnerable because I can't stand to feel my own vulnerability. It's too powerful, it's too overwhelming. Now, the dismissing type we're actually going to avoid. It is the least well understood and the least common. The research on it is a little conflicting. If anybody wants to talk about it more in the Q&A, we can go into it. But it's one that I think is less relevant, so we're just going to leave that one and move on. All right, now, I think at this point you can kind of see where I'm going with our experience of ambiguous relationships, ambiguous experiences in our relationship with God. So the securely attached person experiences, let's say my situation, my prayers for my child's life were not answered. It's painful. They're going to struggle with it, but it'll be easier for them to say, all right, God has something better in mind. The baby is in heaven. I know that I'm loved. There is some other plan that he has for me. And they will be able to process that and move on. Now, we're going to spend most of our time talking about preoccupied and fearful. The preoccupied person, as we said, responds by very tight, clinging behavior, but also with a tremendous amount of anger. They're going to experience the lack of a response to their prayer as rejection. Now, they may not be fully aware they're doing this, but it will be a very quick and sort of instinctive response. In their prayer life, what that's going to mean is they're going to alternate back and forth between sort of angrily berating God for abandoning them and also clinging very tightly and asking for signs of his providence and his care and his love. They're going to be stuck in these very painful emotions and ruminative thoughts that'll make it hard for them to get past this in their spiritual life. So it's going to be like the prayer of Job for a very long time. Where were you? How could you abandon me? And they will be stuck in that. They're also likely to experience a lot of guilt and self-blame. The preoccupied style experiences a great deal of guilt because I have a negative view of myself but a positive view of you, I assume that if there's conflict, it's my fault. And in the spiritual life, I think this is a particular risk because we are very much not indoctrinated, but taught clearly that we are sinful. And often with God, it is our fault. So there can be a tendency with this style to exaggerate this sense of it being my fault. If I had prayed harder, if I had trusted God more, if I had been more holy or said more rosaries or more novenas, then maybe God would have answered my prayers. All right, let's move on to the fearful attachment style now. Now, they experience the same levels of anxiety as the preoccupied style, but as I said, they have to maintain this image of being competent and independent and kind of untouchable. The first thing that tends to mean for the spiritual life is that they depend less on God. They are less quick to go to God and ask him for help with what they're experiencing. In their mind, it has to be a really big thing for them to bother God with, because I'm sure God has more important things to do with his time. It also means that they have more difficulty being emotionally vulnerable and honest in their prayer life with him. So they are going to experience more of an emotional detachment and a kind of numbness. They are more prone to experience spiritual dryness. They will assume that it's likely to assume that it is being tested, but in fact, it's this kind of emotional distance they're putting between themselves and God. They will also feel a tremendous amount of anger, because again, anger is driven by anxiety and they have high levels of anxiety, but it's very threatening to express anger towards God. We believe that that's sinful. I'm not trusting him. He doesn't abandon us, so my anger is wrong. What the fearful person is going to do is try to slam a door on all those emotions. I'm not going to feel my hurt, my abandonment, or my anger. I'm simply going to cut off those feelings. You can't just cut off some of your feelings and not others, though, so that increases that sense of emotional distancing and deadness and this kind of deep, perduring emotional dryness. Now, I think this type Now, this is my own reasoning from the research, but I believe that this type might be the most at risk for walking away from their relationship with God. People who have a real relationship with God, a real faith, but have experienced deep hurt that they simply cannot get past, coupled with this long-lasting feeling of dryness, which they will also interpret as God abandoning them. There's no sense of consolation in his being present in their life, may be at risk for saying, I'm done. I can't do this anymore, and walking away. Now, in couples therapy, we have this expression, it's never about what it's about. If there is intense emotion going on that seems out of proportion to what is the immediate trigger, there's something deeper at root. And if you don't address the thing that's underneath, you're not going to make any improvement in the relationship. And I'm sure you would agree with that. So in our spiritual life also, if you're experiencing this kind of intensely painful, confusing struggle with God, take the time, if you can, first find an excellent spiritual director, but find a very sympathetic and skilled counselor to help you understand what you might be bringing to your relationship with God that is exacerbating that pain and struggle. And I want to end on a note of hope here. Our attachment style does tend to last with us through life. But you can actually develop what they refer to as earned security. You can move towards a greater security in your relationships. You may not entirely jump categories, but you can slide on the continuum. It's also true that it's easier to develop a secure relationship with God than with other people. What we believe about God's fidelity and his love and his perfection does make a difference. And that makes it easier to have confidence that he will not abandon us. We may have to work for that belief and confidence, but we can. And the process of moving towards a more secure attachment to God and a deepening security in that relationship can then have this lovely upward spiral that can lead to greater security in our human relationships as well. So I always encourage people to think about those things and to incorporate your humanity into your spiritual life. Thank you.
Our next topic is life-giving love in open adoption, a foundation of friendship. Our presenters are Teresa Hess and Suzy Younger. Teresa Hess is a former English teacher for the Language and Catechetical Institute in Austria. She is currently pursuing a degree in nursing from Edison State College and works at Upper Valley Medical Center as a patient care technician. When not studying or working, she is chasing around after her 2-year-old daughter, Zelly, and planning her upcoming wedding. Teresa resides in Troy, Ohio. Suzy Younger is a certified fertility care practitioner in a hospital-based program where she assists couples in learning the Creighton model fertility care system. Professionally, she supports couples in practicing natural family planning, assisting those trying to conceive, offers medical alternatives to contraception, and teaches women of all ages how to be active participants in monitoring, preserving, and/or restoring their own gynecological and procreative health. She serves at the University of Notre Dame as coordinator of the marriage preparation and is active within the Loyola Center for Ethics and Culture, both as faculty for the, oops, that's me telling me this time is up for the last presentation. Serves as both faculty for the Vita Institute and in leading Vocation to Love, a weekly women's discussion group exploring questions of identity in light of our Christian faith and contemporary pro-life feminism. She is a frequent lecturer on campus, preparing Master of Divinity students, seminarians, future physicians, and the general student population to better understand the theology and biology behind the church's teaching on marriage and family planning. At home, she strives to keep her sanity and sense of humor amidst the many demands of marriage, motherhood, and homeschooling, and looks for ways to sanctify the daily grind so that she and her family may live each day with greater faith, joy, and holiness. She and her husband, Dave, are blessed to be parents of 3 beautiful children gifted to them by God through adoption. Let's welcome them both.
All right, well, it's great to be here. I do talk a lot. I've never gotten to talk in this capacity, though. I speak on adoption quite frequently. We chose to sit because I think we both approach this like we'd rather just have a cup of coffee and have this chat, so we're going to keep it a little bit less formal, if you will. But so in adoption, we look at adoption as being very pro-life. You know, more and more pro-life groups are seizing upon that and presenting adoption as a loving option, not as the most loving option, which is a clear distinction Teresa will come to, but as a loving option. But also that, so it's pro-life and it's pro-love, but very few have a firsthand experience. Right? Very few of us have been like firsthand experience of having adoption in our families or of making a placement of adoption with our child or receiving a child through adoption. And so I always knew the time would come, I think we both did, that someday we would speak together. So this is 7 years in the making. You're the first audience to receive it. It's still very real, very vulnerable. We had the Kleenex out prepping again last night. But that's good, right? That's honest and it's sincere. And so we don't claim to speak for all adoptions. We don't claim to speak for all open adoptions. But I think what we hear more than anything is all the negative. We hear all of the horror stories of what happened and how this adoption went wrong or how openness was just horrible or it led to the rejection of the child. That's all we hear. And so we both feel very passionately like God has written something beautiful in our story and it needs to be shared so that we can start stripping away the fear and start seeing that this can be incredibly beautiful. So clearly, so Liesl, Elizabeth is our daughter, and her birth father is also involved. I just say at the beginning, like we won't speak to that because that's his story to share, and he's not, here with us today. But obviously, he's very involved as well, and I'm sure he would have his own great points to make. So we're going to share from a different perspective. Mine comes from 5 years of infertility with my husband, and really begging John Paul II and Mother Teresa to bring us the gift of a child by any route, adoption, foster care, conception. We weren't all that picky. We just knew we were called to marriage and parenthood. And so we kept praying that these two would intercede for us and bring us the gift of a child. And after 5 years, all we had to show for it were 15 failed adoptions. So 15 times we'd offered to welcome a child through adoption. 5 birth mothers chose to parent, 5 chose other adoptive families, and 5 had aborted. So our heart was absolutely crushed. It's like, would we suck, sort of to your point, like we're trying to do this all right. Like, would we stink as parents this much that we can't even get this to happen? And so there was a lot of challenge. But in fall of 2010, actually very beginning, January of 2011, a little one showed up on our radar, and he had been placed in foster care at birth. And my friend called me and she's like, Suzy, have you ever thought about foster care? And I'm like, oh my gosh, put my heart in a blender again, right? Like 15 failed adoptions, now you want me to foster attach the child, and then the child would have to go back to I don't know what. And anyway, long story short, God really worked a beautiful story in our hearts at that point. And we ended up welcoming this little one, and his birth name is actually John Paul. He's named after his birth father, so I kid you not, on his birth certificate it says John Paul, last name, comma, Roman numeral 2. So the kid, and it got a little better because he's born on Mother Teresa's feast day. So we had a lot of confirmation in that, and it got over the fear, but with foster care, it was closed. We never had any interaction. In fact, we were advised against having interaction. Okay, fast forward, fall of 2012, we get a request from a friend. She says, hey, I'm working with this birth mom. She's interested in open adoption, or she's interested in adoption. One thing leads to another. She's like, oh, by the way, the birth mom's my sister. And I was like, oh, okay. And she's like, and I gave her your Facebook page to check out. So keep your profiles clean. So that's how Teresa and I originally connected. Then we get to know each other, and she says, oh, I'm interested in open adoption, and now all the fear sets in again. Okay, I could do another adoption, but open is different. Like, what does that even mean? And what would that look like? And then for me, it was also the concern of knowing that I would have a closed adoption and now an open. How am I going to balance the kids' stories to honor the life and love and their unique experiences? So that's where I'll stop. But we pretty much had a choice to be fearful or faithful. Mm-hmm. And Padre Pio and St. Therese were on the case for the second one, and you were due on Padre Pio's feast day, yeah. And her name is Teresa. So we sort of had confirmation in that one as well, but I'll let her take it from here.
I'm Teresa. I'll start with a quick little, I think it's a funny story. Like Suzy said, a lot of the time you don't hear many positive things. And I think especially for like the term birth mother is so vague and it's used in so many different capacities. I think most people think, crack addict or, something like that. And it's so the fact that we have such an open relationship. So this was just last year. We were picking up Liesel from ballet, and most of you know her. So she's just this awesome spark of life who is so open and just wants to share her news with the world. And so there was a stranger that we just ran up to, and she was like explaining our connection. And I thought she did a very good job of it. At that time she was 6. And this woman looked at me and she's like, "Oh my God, are you a surrogate?" And I was like, "No, I'm a birth mother." And she was like disappointed. And I was like, "So clearly we don't talk about this enough." So yeah, my story kind of starts my sophomore year at Franciscan University. I got pregnant, and adoption was not on my radar really at all until I was about 6 to 7 months along. I grew up Catholic. I'm from the kind of like cookie cutter, 6 kids. My brother's a priest. My parents had done all the right things, but it's still, anyways. I felt like with that kind of a background, and especially where I was when it happened, I felt like I'd committed kind of like the capital sin, like almost to the level of this is as bad as it's going to get. So I was so afraid of making another wrong decision on top of the situation I found myself in. And that was a real struggle during the pregnancy, because I felt like the desires I had for myself and my family and the desires I had for my child weren't reconciling. And on top of that, a lot of some of the pro-life centers or people I came in contact with, adoption is the loving choice. And it was almost presented to me as the most loving choice. You don't have a nuclear family, so of course this is what you would want for your child. And so that was hard to reconcile. So that was one point. But as we all know, it's not, and you're choosing between two goods. And so as my relationship progressed with her birth father, we just kind of realized, okay, we're not working this out, and so we should look at all the options. And so in looking at all the options, that led us to adoption. So for various reasons, I felt like if I was called to do this, it would need to be a private adoption versus through an agency. I won't really get into why, because 18 minutes. But it was really going to have to be a God thing, because it's how do you even go about that without, like Suzy said, it's almost like profiles of, families just waiting, almost desperate for these children. And it's that's really overwhelming. And it's just kind of awkward all around. So, and then on top of that, I was I don't know much about adoption, but as soon as I looked into it, there's 3 basic kinds of adoption. There's closed, there's semi-open, and there's open. And all that means, it's very basic, is that closed, you're not allowed to have legal contact. Semi-open is contact through a third party. And open means you're allowed to have legal contact with them directly. And it looks like whatever you want it to look like, and there is no way to make it legally enforceable. Because once you sign over your parental rights, that's it. And so I said, well, that's what I would want, because I would want to be able to have that contact, but I didn't know even what that would look like. So another reason I wanted an open adoption was the most important thing for me was that my child would know that here we go, that she was always loved and wanted from the beginning. Yep, hold on. And I'd heard so many horror stories of children who were adopted and then had this identity crisis at 16 because they had this whole void of never knowing why. And I was like, well, if we can avoid that at all possible, that would be great. So I felt like an open adoption was the best way to make that happen. So again, I did not know what I was asking for. So as Suzy said, my sister kind of put us in touch with each other, and we met for the first time. There's another funny story. So again, it's what does that even look like? So it was a little awkward. We were all nervous. I felt really reserved because, again, I felt like this could be a really good thing, but at the same time, it's not something that I really wanted. It wasn't So we met, and they were just great. I mean, they had John Paul with them, and Suzy and Dave are just so open and loving. And, they're showing us all these pictures. They're like, let's just sit down and we'll just tell you about ourselves. And this is what our life looks like. And at the end, they were like, so do you have any questions for us? And I was like, thinking, yeah, like I have like 100 questions. And the only thing that came out was, so do you guys have any pets? And then I was like, oh my God, what did I just say? But that was the beginning of the beginning. So that meeting alone really laid that foundation for trust in our relationship. And it's because of one of the very first things Suzy said. She just sat down and looked at us and said, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to parent your child. And she was one of the first people that said that to me, like from like, quote, like the other side of things. And she just said, no, I'm not going to get it correct. It was like 8 years ago. So in a nutshell, she said, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to parent your child. So we're very honored to even be here and that you thought of us. And if you think that God's plan involves us, then we are open to whatever he has. So I sat with that and I was very impressed by that. And that really was the first, that was the foundation for trust. So again, I decided about 11 days before she was born that this relationship was going to actually happen. And again, like Suzy said, I decided as singular, but that's not the truth. Her birth father was 100% a part of the decision, and this wouldn't be possible without him either. But I wanted to give him credit in this moment, but also recognize that he has his own story and want to respect that. So after this decision was made, she was born early, 11 days later, and they left the hospital with Elizabeth. And so after that, it was this grief process started. Like as a birth mother, kind of like going through all the stages of grief, and then also realizing, okay, we have this new relationship, and I don't know what my role is. And so that's been an ongoing process. But I guess the 2 points I want to make, kind of like to reference Alistair's talk yesterday about virtue. In this friendship, virtue has been what has saved me through it, because it really is, you really just have to die to yourself. And both these two parties are coming together because they want this child to be loved, wanted, safe, happy, healthy, and holy. And that's the common vision. And I think it was C.S. Lewis who said, like, friends are friends because they see the same truth. And so that was the common truth that we were both working toward, and no matter what that looked like. And for me, that was overcoming a lot of fear, of pride, of really just having to die to myself and just keep showing up. So we would have these visits, and it was like, what do you want this to look like? I'm like, I will just show up. I'm just going to be here so she can look back and see that I was there. And so that's what we do. So yeah, we both went in blind. We just keep showing up. And Suzy and Dave's trust, love, and respect is really the foundation of our friendship. And I need to stop talking because it's Suzy's turn, but
You're good.
yep.
Well,
That's
we
a
can take
good
more
start.
Q&A if we want to. I would just say that I would look at this in the context of friendship, because if we talk about open adoption, we don't actually say the word friendship. Like, no one thinks about that in general. And so I broke it down, and I was like, really, it came into 3 friendships: my friendship with God, my growing friendship, our entire family with your entire family, and our friendship with the broader community. And most times when you make a friendship, you're authentically yourself. Someone sees that, they like that, they want to hang out and experience your authentic self a little bit more, and you decide to become friends. We weighed the commitment and then got to know each other almost. So there was a stress to me to keep up what I had tried to authentically present myself and what felt like I was trying to buy a baby, which was really awkward. I'm like, I'm not. How do you balance we would be honored and would love to receive the gift of this child, but we're not give us your baby, right? How do you? So I was very conscious of that. She's right, it's the most awkward meeting ever. And actually worse was dinner afterwards. We went to a Mexican restaurant and we all just sort of stared at each other across the table. We're like,
We were so spent.
yeah, we were exhausted. But I wanted to make a good impression, not too eager, not too laissez-faire. I remember walking into the hospital and seeing, she has a gorgeous family. Her sisters are just stunningly beautiful inside and out. And I was like, oh my gosh, now they're all going to be looking at me. Okay. And, and when we were out in the hallway actually praying a rosary with her, we call him Father Uncle Dan or Frunkle Dan in our family, while she was in labor and we heard her cries. And then when we were brought in, I couldn't even hold her at first. I just remember holding Teresa's hand. I'm like, I cannot consciously take this child out of your arms. Like, pretty much you're going to have to give her. And so I just remember like gripping your hand, as you handed me Elizabeth, and doing this. And then now when you have a priestly uncle in the family, you get to celebrate mass in the hospital room after you've delivered your baby, which is great and brutal. Because I don't know whether he picked the readings, but next thing you know, he's giving this homily on us all being the body of Christ. I was like, oh, for the love, right? Because she did what I can't do, right? And I'm doing not necessarily what she couldn't do, but what we felt called for me to do. Like, we had our purposes in the body of Christ. And so we're sitting there, and he's like, if you can't, if your hand, be a great hand. If your foot, be a good foot. And I'm just like bawling, and then he starts crying. He can't even finish his homily. And we're celebrating Mass on like the meal tray in the hospital room. Leaving the hospital was also brutal. It took a little bit longer for the paperwork. I'm sure the decision to finally leave the hospital was its own determined trauma. But Dave and I are sitting in this room going, the baby should be here. Why isn't the baby here? Why isn't the baby here? Where's the baby? Oh my gosh, what's happening? And then you bring her down, and I just remember you looking at me and you said, she's going to have a great life with you. And I remember, I remember holding her hand again, saying, that's because you're going to be in it. And I would still say that today. She has the most incredible life because her family's still in it. I bounce between guilt, grief, and gift constantly in those first several weeks. If it was any other woman, I would have been at her side, counseling her, but that was not my role in this story. My role was to be the best mother I could be. And so when we first met at Liesel's baptism, again, Father Uncle Dan helps with the baptism, whole family comes in. I cleaned more for their visit than I did for the home study. Weeks of cleaning. And I was just like, how do I encounter her for the first time? Because I know how brutal this is. And how my joy is coming at someone else's sorrow. So how can I live out that joy and yet be sensitive and empathic, right? How do we balance this? And our Lord very clearly said, you treat her like you would my mother. Because she gave birth to the Christ child. We know through scripture, she wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in the manger. She didn't hold him to herself. She knew what his purpose and his mission was, and selfishly she laid him in the manger as Teresa laid her in our arms. So that has really guided us a lot. We've always shared the story with our kids of their adoption from beginning to end. We visited Austria when she was living over there. I flew over with a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old by myself to Austria, and Teresa met me in Vienna, and I don't know, we're crazy. We do things like ski 6 weeks after she delivered Zelly. We just do nutsy things. So, but we call it brutiful. Teresa coined the terms, it's brutal. It's brutal and it's beautiful. We wouldn't have it any other way. We've had beautiful moments, where Liesel comes home from zoo camp and she says, Mommy, why don't people think that adoption is love? And I'm like, I don't know. What do you think? She's like, well, my friend at zoo camp doesn't understand why my birth mom would throw me away. I said, well, what do you think? She's like, well, I think I'm incredibly loved and wanted. And I'm like, yes, you are. How did this come up? She's like, well, I was telling her about my 4 mothers. And I'm like, I'm sorry, what? But we've always told her she has 4 mothers. She has her birth mother, she has me, she has her godmother, and she has Our Lady as her 4 mothers. And so she's trying to explain this to this poor innocent child at birth camp while they're just talking about kangaroos. Sorry, I'll try to wrap it up here. And, long story short, she's this little advocate. She actually wants to speak today, so I don't know. I told her I would feel it out, but she's like, I think God's wanting me to share something. And I was like, oh my gosh. But there's been brutal departures too, where she asked Teresa, can't you just adopt me back? I just want to be in both places. Or one day, 5 minutes into the visit, she says to Teresa, I love being adopted, but it's hard too. These are the things, but we handle it together and in friendship. So the friendships that help are the ones that bring meals, the one that hold our hands, the one that support us, the ones that offer support. The difficult ones are we have faced a lot of persecution in very surprising places. This is my final comment, but we've faced surprising persecution from self-professed committed Catholics living out their faith that actually will not let us around their families anymore. They will not let us with their children. And we sit here and we question, why is that? Because, and I think it's because it's a child out of wedlock, but folks, we all have different things we would do differently, or we push completely out of community. And it has devastatingly affected these friendships to the point where you say, but look, we're giving life, we're giving love. If we're going to say we're a pro-life community, what does that actually look like when the rubber meets the road? And so those have been very challenging. So I would just say in the closing statement is that when I knew it was time to do this talk together for this conference was in the description when it said, what does it look like to make the good of another your own? And I thought, that's exactly what we've done. Because in making the good of the child, we have each found our own good in the relationship through the glory of God. So thank you.
Questions, comments? You can use the mic or stand where you are, but please identify yourself.
The Dominicans come through again.
Hello, I'm Brother John, Western Dominican Province Friar, and I have a question for Jennifer. It has to do with your attachment styles chart and how you can have a positive or negative view of yourself and a positive and negative view of others. And you said it's possible to slide along the continuum. So that's what I want to ask about. In light of another comment you made where you can't cut off some of your feelings without cutting off others. So my question is, well, if you're in the negative spot, shouldn't you try to cut off your negative feelings of self and others to move towards the positive quadrant? And how can you do that, or can you do that without cutting off other feelings?
I think, okay, so kind of a multi-part question. Yes, you can move towards greater security. So you grow up with some negative experiences, but you're not bound by your early experiences, right? Our childhood matters, but it's not everything. So let's say you have some early anxiety, but then you meet wonderful friends, you have a truly loving, supportive spouse. Gradually you begin to feel more confident, more loved, and also more confident in relationships in general. So that's a way to move towards security. You can also unfortunately move away. Someone who has a wonderful childhood marries an abusive spouse. They now have an anxiety that they didn't have before. So the way we process future relationships affects us, for sure. But I would say, as to your second question, cutting off emotions is never the way to growth. You cannot progress towards health by ignoring a wound, any more than you could in a medical setting. I'm limping because I have gangrene, but if I just ignore that, I'm sure I can run that race and do just fine. It's the power of positive thinking, right? So what has to happen is that you need to examine those expectations you have. Remember I said you have these early experiences and then you form expectations about yourself and other people. You have to go back and look at those expectations. Find times in your life where you've received information that was actually contrary to those expectations and begin to learn from that. One of the problems is that we have a sort of self-confirming bias. I think people are going to reject me, and so that's what I see. And I can even make it happen. With the person who, the fearful type, he gets the text, and he says, he's going to, or she is going to break up with me. I'm going to break up with them first, right? I make my fears happen because of the fears that I have. So by doing counseling, by working through a greater awareness of your woundedness, you're able to say, okay, wait a minute, I'm getting a little antsy here. I do tend to overreact. Let me sit with this for a minute. Maybe I'm not going to be rejected. Maybe I should actually ask them what on earth they mean and have that conversation. And by doing that, the more you do that, the more you can grow in greater security. And that's the way to move towards health.
Mr. Donnelly, well, she's here. Can I have her?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, just real quick, because on the way in, Liesl said that she felt like God wanted her to share something, but she was a little nervous. So I said, if she still wanted to, she could. But you're going to hear it with me for the first time. What would you say? You can do it. Do you want me to say what you said earlier? Yeah. Okay. What did God say? Why is choosing adoption good?
Because
the nerves are getting, I'll translate. She said, adoption is a good choice because
instead of killing your baby,
because instead of, okay, this is how we're going to do this. Because instead of killing your baby, you give your baby life. And instead of not seeing them again, that you have a chance to be with them and that they know they're loved. So there you go. Did I get it right?
yeah.
Yes. All right, good job, kiddo.
It's almost sacrilege to ask for questions after that. Questions, comments?
I have a question about the attachment lecture, and I guess I was wondering whether you think there are any dangers to being on the positive side, because I guess I think that an important part of understanding our relationship with God and Christ is that we're given salvation even though we've done nothing to deserve it, and often like God's love comes even though we don't deserve it at all. And so I'm wondering if there's any danger at all. It sounds like the positive view is always sort of a positive with a sort of honest. You're aware of things about you that are actually positive. But is there a danger to being on that side of the spectrum and sort of missing that aspect of our relationship with God?
That's a lovely question. I really like that question. Let me think about this for a couple of seconds. I think what you're saying is it possible, if you have such a positive view of yourself, to basically become a narcissist, right? So that you believe that you deserve all the good things that you're given. I would say that actually, I'm going to pull this up again. That would put you in the dismissing category, I think. I think that's what I would say. So just to touch on this really quickly, you have a positive view of yourself and a negative view of other people. I am better. I don't want intimacy because I don't need it, and I truly believe that. It's not because I'm afraid of being rejected. It's because I truly believe I am better than everybody else. The reason I say this isn't very common is because we're made for intimacy. Everybody really, truly does want intimacy and love. I think, and other researchers have said this as well, the dismissing type may just be such a deeply ingrained defense that they're actually the fearful type, but they've been living with this defense mechanism for so long that now they've lost their own awareness of their desire for relationships. And so it's become very ingrained in their minds that they are truly better than everybody else. So that person will definitely struggle in their spiritual life. And I think you've put your finger on one of the biggest ways that would happen, that sense of entitlement, the lack of an understanding of my own sinfulness, of how much I do not deserve God's love and his salvation. I think that's a beautiful way to see that.
I have a question for Suzy and Teresa. Like you said, Suzy, I think very few people have experience with adoption in their families or in their lives. And I was wondering if you could talk about the language that you and Teresa use in your families and with Liesl to like cultivate like the true understanding of being loved and just I guess about the language you use.
Go for it. I'll start because I sort of took the brunt of that early education, right? We were just talking about like our friendship and our trust was formed while she was so little. She didn't know what was going on all that much. I mean, whoever was holding it could have been any of us. She didn't even know me, right, at the time. But one of the things we have always said, and I took this back from the movie The Help. Do you remember when she's rocking the baby and says, "You are smart, you are kind, you are important"? We added two more where we said, "You are loved and you are wanted." And so every night as she would sleep, like we'd pray over, we'd sing and we'd say, "You're smart, you're kind, you're important, you're loved, you're wanted." And I think that manifested itself absolutely in that zoo camp story where she's like, she actually ended up, like, if you will, evangelizing her little friend at zoo camp, said, "Oh, I'm totally wanted. Everybody I know loves and wants me." And you got, to those of you that don't know, you don't see that shy version that was just up here at all ever. So we're all like, okay, what do we do with this? Because she's like ready to scream it to the rooftop. So that, at least in our language, that's it. And we've always looked at this adoption as love. And even in three very different stories in our life, there's different ways that love looks. Sometimes love is in one of our children's life, the birth family could not parent. Like they could not rehabilitate to a point where it was safe for the child to return, right? That's also love. Sometimes love is saying, I need to know I need help, right? I can't do this on my own. And so I think across all three stories, we've always worked to look at the love behind the action. So that would be from my perspective.
Yeah, and then just basic, I don't like to get too hung up on like titles, because I think that was a really common question in the beginning is like, well, what does she call you? Because, yeah, I'm like, well, Teresa, my name. But, so there wasn't there needed to be a clear distinction of roles for her in the beginning, like Suzy as mother. And then in the beginning, I was like, especially before she really gets, like, now she gets it, you know, and I think she'll keep unpacking that as she gets older. But even before that, I mean, terms like tummy mommy was the first one, turned into birth mommy, you know, still calls me Teresa. And then sometimes, you know, just kind of like whatever comes out. So, but in the beginning, and I think a lot more people get hung up on that than we do, because when you just kind of get to a point where it's just like family's family, you know, I think they're way more worried about the title versus the relationship.
I also think people don't know what question to ask, so that's the first one that comes out. We've been asked really awkward questions, and I mean, we're pretty open, but we're like occasionally we're like, whoa, that was a good one.
Yeah.
So we just weather it together, so it's okay.
Thank you. This question is generally directed towards the whites, but open to anyone. What are some resources that you found helpful for continuing to develop a stronger sense of EQ?
Of course, the stuff that you can find just on emotional intelligence, but where we went for training is a group called, it's RW360, that was actually on the slide. And that's a nonprofit ministry that trains in this direction. And the same guy, Ken Sandy, wrote a book called The Peacemaker, 3rd edition. You get that, you're in conflict, it will walk you through it, but it won't be fun. It's like I always say, be very careful when you read your Bible. Those words in red, they're tough. But those are the two best resources.
I have a question for Suzy and Teresa. If you had the chance to talk to somebody else who's considering an open adoption, where do you normally start with kind of like thinking about what that might best look like for them?
Oh gosh. You can start. You're good at starting.
We actually started tag teaming this because I do so much work with women who find themselves pregnant in situations that they had not expected, and you know, trying to help them parent, help them make an adoption plan, to whatever that they want that to look like, but help them with the options. And just recently, we've started tag teaming them, where I'll call her and say, "Do you have the emotional and logistic, time ability to help me with this one?" And so. More recently, she wrote a beautiful letter to one of the birth moms that I was working with, just explaining her own experience and being a resource. So as far as what she would say, I'll leave that to her. But I think what I just say is it's a chance to continually love on your child. And you actually said that at the very beginning. She said, I look at open adoption as a way for more people to love on the child, which was actually a trigger for me because I was like, wait a second, that's a much bigger community. That I'm losing control. Like there was that sense of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose control over this. Like if I'm just another person who loves the child, like wait, are we all going to co-parent? Like what's this look like? Mm-hmm. But I think when we do look at it, no, it absolutely is more people to love on the child. We now do zoo trips with like your sisters, your brother. I mean, she has a large family. I'm an only child. This is sort of it's a mutual exchange of gifts. You hear adoption is a mutual exchange of gifts. It absolutely has been for us.
Yeah. And what I tried to communicate to that specific mother was that there is hope. We could talk forever about this, but like it took me a solid 5 years for me to see the situation as also beneficial to myself. Like it was very obvious to me that it was a good for her, and so there is hope. And with an open adoption, it's kind of like you just have to keep remembering why you're doing it. And so if you have that mutual core of, for us also faith is huge. That common faith, and then also just that common truth of we want to just love on her, and that is going to look different from what we think it looks like, but that it really manifests quite naturally. And then just also like a shit ton of grace, because you say things that you're like, I just put my foot in my mouth, and things happen, and you're like, that's it. that's it. I severed that cord. Like,
Yeah.
I won't be able to see them again. It's been real. Like, I know.
We have stepped in it so many times, and that was one of my points I didn't get to, is just that without the ability to assume the best of each other, which
Yeah,
ties in
sorry.
your, and like the grace of God, I think it all sort of wraps together, but without the ability to assume the best of each other, oh my gosh, I've said things that are so insensitive at times, and like
But you don't
I
know.
am so sorry. Like, I've reflected, and that was like, I did not mean it the way it came out. And she's like, oh no, we're good. And so I think there's not only what's best for the child, but assuming the best of each other as well.
Let's thank our three speakers.